the Thursday evening, Jesus gathered with his disciples to eat the Passover meal. Later that night, he was arrested and taken into custody. On Friday morning, Friday being the preparation day for the Sabbath, Jesus was brought before Pilate and then taken to King Herod and then brought back to Pilate again. Pilate gave in to the demands of the crowd and handed Jesus over for crucifixion. Jesus was crucified, and after 6 hours of suffering, he died. His death was confirmed by soldiers, and then it was confirmed by Pilate, the governor. The next day, being the Sabbath, Jesus' body was taken down, and he was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea and also Nicodemus. According to Jewish custom, the day ran from sunset to sunset. So the Sabbath, the day of rest, began on Friday at sunset and continued through to Saturday at sunset. And Jesus was in the tomb throughout that time. The Sabbath was the 7th day of the week, equivalent to our Saturday, and it was then followed by the first day of the week, equivalent to our Sunday. Now, the Sabbath ended Saturday night and Saturday at sunset, and then continued through the night into the next day, being our Sunday. So we pass through that night and we come to what in our terms is Sunday morning. And several things had taken place. According to Matthew 27 verses 62 and onwards, a guard had been placed on Jesus' tomb. The priests were worried that Jesus' body would be taken away, stolen, and it then be claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead. So they wanted guards to prevent that from happening. Jesus, as I said, stayed in the tomb, and we come to somewhere during that Saturday night, the early hours of Sunday morning, and there was an earthquake, according to Matthew 28 and verse 2. Now we go back to Matthew chapter 27. There had been an earthquake at the time that Jesus died. That earthquake, Jesus' body was taken down from the tomb and was buried. Somewhere in the early hours of Sunday morning, while it was still dark, there was another earthquake, and that was connected with an angel coming down from heaven and rolling away the stone from the tomb's entrance. So that indicates there were 2 earthquakes, one at the time of Jesus' death and one at the time of the tomb being opened. An angel of the Lord had come down, as we read in Matthew 28 verses 2 and onwards. Now that brings us through to sunrise, Sunday morning, and we're going to follow the description of events as were given in Matthew chapter 28, also filling in some of the details from Mark, Luke and John. What we see here in Matthew 28 are 3 groups of people: the women who come to the tomb, the guard who are at the tomb, and also the disciples. As I say, we fill in some of the details from the other writers. Now, the day immediately after Jesus' death was the Jewish Sabbath. It was a day of rest on which no work was to be done. So Jesus was buried before the start of the Sabbath, and then the women had to wait from that Friday evening through until the Sunday morning daybreak before they could go to the tomb and anoint Jesus' body as per Jewish custom. Matthew only identifies two of the women. In Matthew 28 and verse 1, we've got Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. We've got the same two mentioned in Matthew 27 and verse 61. Mary Magdalene was there and the other Mary. So these two had been there at Jesus' burial, and then they came early Sunday morning to anoint Jesus' body. The one described here as the other Mary may well be Mary, the wife of Clopas. There's a number of Marys that are mentioned. If it had been Mary, the mother of Jesus, surely Matthew would have identified her as such. And then if we go to Mark's account and to Luke's account, we've got an indication that other women were there as well. So they're all going to the tomb around sunrise. But they arrive at the tomb and they are told that Jesus is not there because he has arisen. Matthew 28 and verse 5. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he was lying." And they do so. Now, what we're reading, the other accounts, such as Mark, the angel now is in the tomb, and there is another angel there. Matthew focuses upon the angel that is speaking. So then the women are told to go and tell the disciples the news that Jesus is once again alive. But what happens as they set out to go to the disciples, Jesus appears to them and so gives further confirmation that he is alive. Unfortunately, as we'll read in a while from Luke's account, the disciples weren't willing to believe that, although two of them, Peter and John, do go to the tomb in order to check out these reports that they've received. Now, Jesus, as I said, appears to the women as they're heading towards the disciples. And he also appears to Mary Magdalene. There's an account of that over in John chapter 20, beginning in verse 11. And it takes some thought to piece together what happens. It appears that Mary somehow is travelling to Jerusalem, to the disciples, perhaps on a separate route to the other women. So the other women meet Jesus as they're heading into the city. John and Peter head to the tomb to check the women's report that Jesus has risen. Mary Magdalene meets up with them. They continue on to the tomb, and then Jesus meets up with her and confirms to her that he is indeed alive. So that's what happens with the women all at this early stage of the Sunday morning, the resurrection day. But for more than a century, we've had alternate views put forward trying to deny the account, to say that the Bible is just a fake and so forth. One of the claims that has been raised down through the years is that the women went to the wrong tomb. They came to the wrong tomb, didn't realise that, the tomb's empty, and so led to this idea of Jesus being raised from the dead. And people say, if you read the Bible account, it was the early hours of the morning. In fact, it was dark when they set out, so they couldn't see clearly, and again, that led to them making a mistake about the tomb. Now, there's various problems with that idea. Yes, it was dark when they set out, but it's at sunrise, so things are getting brighter even as they journey to the tomb. And this throws a question at the skeptics who are trying to criticize this. They're inconsistent because they say, yes, there were women, and yes, they were heading to what they thought was Jesus' tomb, and yes, it was the early hours of the morning. So in other words, the skeptics take all of those details as being factual. They say, yeah, you can believe the Bible on that, but the idea that it was Jesus' tomb they found empty, no, we won't accept that. So there is a consistency in the way that skeptics will try to attack the biblical account. They'll believe parts of it, but not other parts of it. And you then have to ask, why would the women go to the wrong tomb? Number one, as I said, it is daylight. As they approach the tomb, the day is getting brighter as they're going along. It's what we call a dynamic, changing situation. They set out before sunrise, but as they go on their way, the sun comes up, and so things get brighter. And also, two of the women at least had been there at Jesus' burial, which was less than 48 hours earlier. And this wasn't a big anonymous lawn cemetery. This was a private tomb. It was the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And I could go on and add the fact that there had been Roman guards there, so you imagine probably they'd had a fire going during the night, so there were signs of activity there around the tomb. So you question this idea of the women going to the wrong tomb. And then, of course, what about the report that Peter and John went to the tomb and found it empty? Are we to believe that they went to the wrong tomb? And if they went to the wrong tomb, what about the grave clothes that they found in that tomb? How are you going to explain that? And whose tomb was it? It was the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Tombs were often carved into the rocks like a cave. And this one belonged to Joseph. Now, did he never check the tomb? If it was his tomb? So really, there's a whole lot of things that weigh against the idea that the women went to the wrong tomb. And there's something else here too to keep in mind. There is this idea that women were not considered as reliable witnesses back then in the first century. Now, this isn't a biblical teaching. It's not God's teaching. It was the culture of the time. Now, I'm not sure about that view, because if you check, there are references, you can find them online, to the fact that, look, women did give testimony in certain trials and so forth. But if you check in Luke 24 and verse 11, certainly the disciples were skeptical about the report of the women. They go to the disciples, and Luke 24 and verse 11, the women talk to the disciples, but verse 11, these words appeared to them, the disciples, as nonsense, and they would not believe the women. Now, whether that's because the idea of a resurrection was too hard to believe, or whether it was because they were women, I don't know. But, all right, there may have been some skepticism towards women back in those days. Now, let me put this to you. Skeptics will claim in regard to this and other matters that the Bible's a fraud. It's all made up. All right, let's suppose you're trying to concoct this story, and you're in a society where women aren't highly regarded. Would you put forward women as the first witnesses of this resurrection? You think, well, if people were making this story up, they'd want the strongest testimony, and if there was a prejudice, then they'd choose men. The men are finding it hard to believe. It's the women who believe. So you can raise that question. Now, as I say, I'm not sure that women were discounted as witnesses in general, because you can find reports of them giving testimony in regard to various matters. So what I think you've got here is the fact that there is a range of testimony to the empty tomb, that testimony coming both from women and from men, coming from the two disciples, Peter and John, and coming from the women, among others, and so forth. So there's testimony coming from early on Sunday morning that Jesus' tomb is empty and Jesus is alive. That's the women. Then we've got the disciples. The women were to report to the disciples. The women have been told twice to go to the disciples. They're first told by an angel at the tomb. We go back to Matthew 28, verses 7 and 8, and this is the angel speaking. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, and behold, I have told you. So they left the tomb and headed to the disciples. And then as they're on their way, verse 9, and behold, Jesus met them and said, rejoice. And they came up to him, took hold of his feet, worshipped him. And Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go bring word to my brothers to leave for Galilee, and there they will see me. So two urgings, if you like, for the women to go and report the news to the disciples. But as we've seen in Luke 24 and verse 11, the disciples were not willing to take heed of these reports, although John and Peter do go to check. We go over to the book of John 20, and I'll pick it up in verse 4. The two were running together, and the other disciple ran ahead faster than Peter and came to the tomb first, and he stooped to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there. However, he did not go in. So Simon Peter also came, following him, and he entered the tomb and looked at the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but folded up in a place by itself. So the other disciple, and this is John, who had come first to the tomb, also entered there, and he saw and believed, for they did not yet understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead, even though they've been told several times. I'll come back to that. So anyway, they go there, they find this empty tomb with the grave clothes there, and that report, incidentally, does go back to the other disciples as well. But when you go through the day, the disciples really struggled with this idea that Jesus was alive. You've got their initial response in Luke 24 and verse 11 that they just don't believe what the women say. And then if you go over to Luke 24 and a bit further on, Luke 24 and verse 22, there's even later in the day, after they've had several reports, there's still an uncertainty. In Luke 24, beginning with verse 13, you've got the two followers of Jesus who are on the road to a village named Emmaus. That was about 11 kilometers away, and they're walking to Emmaus, and Jesus joins them, but they don't recognize him. And so Jesus asks, about things that have been happening, and they start telling him. But look at their uncertainty. Verse 21, but we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Because Jesus had mentioned the idea previously several times he was going to be raised on the third day. Verse 22, but also some women among us left us bewildered when they were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And so some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it exactly as the women also had said, but him they did not see. So they're aware of the women's report, they're aware of what Peter and John found, and yet there's still this hesitancy. In fact, they, rather than saying we were delighted at the good news, they said we were bewildered. Going back up to verse 22. So here we are heading towards evening on that Sunday, and it still seems to be confusion amongst the disciples. Well, Jesus does appear to the disciples shortly afterwards, and I'll come back to that. But Thomas is not with them. And now Thomas digs in his heels. It doesn't matter that the other disciples say, look, we've seen Jesus. Thomas gives this response over in John chapter 20 and verse 24. But Thomas, one of the 12, who was called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to him, we have seen the Lord. But he said, unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. That's it. He has to wait another 8 days before it's confirmed to him. So it's Jesus has talked to his disciples during his ministry about what would happen, including his death, burial, and resurrection. But when it comes to events, the disciples just really don't know what to make of it all. And it's as though Jesus has to confront them and propel them into belief. For instance, Luke 24 and verse 36, what happens is the two that were on the way to Emmaus finally realize that it is Jesus, so they make the 11-kilometer journey back to the disciples in Jerusalem. So this, as it was late in the day when they were with Jesus, these two, the fact that they then go 11 kilometres back would suggest that we're now into the evening, and they report to the disciples, and then Jesus himself appears in Luke 24 and verse 36. Now, while they were telling these things, Jesus himself suddenly stood in their midst and said to them, peace be to you. And they were startled and frightened, and they thought that they were looking at a spirit. But he said to them, why are you frightened, and why are doubts arising in your own hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. He is referring to the wounds from the crucifixion. Touch me and see, because the spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you plainly see that I have. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they still could not believe it because of their joy and astonishment, he said to them, have you anything here to eat? And they served him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in front of them. Why did he eat it? To show that he's a physical being, that he's not a ghost. He's real. So he has to, as I said, push them into belief. It really is me. He said, well, then you got Thomas. And Thomas was away with that appearance of Jesus. And he comes back to the 12, and they tell him what's happened. He said, no, I'm not going to believe it. So John chapter 20 and verse 26, 8 days later, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst and said, peace be to you. And he then said to Thomas, place your finger here and see my hands, and take your hand and put it into my side. Remember, he'd been speared on the side. Do not continue in disbelief, but be a believer. And Thomas answered and said to him, My Lord and my God. The Lord of me and the God of me is the literal saying there. So Thomas finally, 8 days after the resurrection, said, oh, okay, yes, the resurrection has taken place. Now, again, you've got skeptics who try to change this around. They say, well, the apostles concocted this story. It's just something that they made up. Well, if this is something that they made up, we know historically that Christianity spread there in the first century, and it spread quite rapidly and extensively. So are we to believe that if the disciples made this up, they then spent the rest of their lives preaching Christianity, getting persecuted for it, and it appears even being martyred for it? Are we to believe that they did that knowing that they themselves had concocted this story? But then there's another reaction to it. People say it's unfair. The disciples had difficulty believing, and so Jesus presented himself and gave them clear proof. What about us? We don't get that clear proof. Well, in actual fact, we do have proof. And it's in the form of authentic reports, authentic written testimony. That's what this is. This is written testimony to historical events. It's like, well, no, that's the Bible. Yeah, but the Bible consists of an awful lot of historical documentation, if you want to call it that way. I've talked about this many times over the years, how the Bible is shown to be a reliable historical testimony to real events. Now, all of us here, we know a bit about history. We know a bit about maybe world geography. We know a bit about science. And I put it to all of us that a lot of that belief in these things doesn't come from us personally witnessing these things. I wasn't there to see it, and you weren't there to see various things. For me, anything before 1954, I wasn't there. I didn't even exist. So what did we do? We went to school. We studied textbooks and so forth. We perhaps were given copies of original documents, all of these sorts of things, or we've been to museums where we've seen them. In other words, we've been relying upon documentation, and that tells us that this event took place, that that person lived, and so forth and so on. And so it is with the Bible, that what we have here is a book that can be shown again and again and again to be historically, geographically accurate, and therefore from this source we have the testimony, the evidence that Jesus did indeed arise from the dead. So that's the disciples, and we've also talked about the women. And now I want to come to a third group that Matthew refers to, which is the guards, the Roman guards, in conjunction with the Jewish leaders, the Jewish Sanhedrin, the priests and so forth. Now, the guards had been appointed at the request of the priests to guard Jesus' tomb so that nobody could fake the idea of a resurrection by stealing Jesus' body. The fact that the priests went to Pilate about this, and later the fact that the priests have to assure the guards that if they've got any problems from Pilate, they'll deal with it, that tells us that these are Roman guards. Otherwise, Pilate didn't need to have anything to do with the matter. So there's a group of Roman guards. They're placed on the tomb in an attempt to prevent the resurrection. They don't prevent the resurrection. In fact, down in chapter 28 and verse 4 of Matthew, the guards are actually eyewitnesses to the angel that appears. So the guards make their way into the city, or some of them, and they report to the priests. And I pick it up in Matthew 28 and verse 11. Now, while they were on their way, and that's talking about the women, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, so this seems to be the gathering of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, his disciples came at night and stole him while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, Pilate, we will appease him and keep you out of trouble." And they took the money and did as they had been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day, to the day that Matthew wrote this account. So here you've got another attempt to deny the facts. This story that the guards had fallen asleep, and while they were asleep, the apostles had taken the body. You've got problems with that. Number one, for Roman guards to be negligent of their duty, to fall asleep whilst on duty, and then to go around telling people, that was not the right thing to be doing. Because you can go back and you can check some of the Roman records. Punishment for neglect of duty could either be being beaten by a cudgel or even by even being executed. That's why the priests here in verse 14 have to assure the guards that if there's problems, they will go and talk to Pilate. Because these guards, if they had died, and well, they would have. Let me start this again. If these guards really had fallen asleep, and that was reported to Pilate, it could have meant their execution. So the priest had to step in and assure the guards that, no, we'll deal with that. You're not going to get executed for that. But there's another problem here too. The story is from the guards who've been bribed, "Oh, we fell asleep and the apostles came and stole the body." Well, hang on. If you've fallen asleep, what's the problem? You don't know what happened. You're asleep. You don't know it was the disciples that came and stole the body. It could have been anything. So the story doesn't make sense from a logical point of view. Furthermore, if it was the disciples that stole the body, then that still meant that they spent the rest of their lives on a mission proclaiming Christianity, knowing that the whole thing was based upon a fraud and that they had been part of that fraud. If you read through the literature, going back to the 1860s and even to a lesser degree earlier, you'll find various skeptics challenging the biblical account. They put forward their theories, their opinions, their claims to give an alternate point of view. But they don't back it up with evidence. They don't say where they got the evidence for their alternate theories. And what's more, if you sit down and think through their claims and examine the evidence, the claims of the skeptics just do not stand up to close examination. So you've got the women who went to the tomb, you've got the disciples, and you've got the Roman guards who were bribed by the priests. And what I find particularly interesting in all of this is the response of the apostles on the day of Jesus' resurrection. Jesus had told his disciples on various occasions during his ministry that he would be crucified and raised up from the dead on the third day. They knew that the Sunday was the third day because the two men on the road to Emmaus had confirmed that fact. The women saw the empty tomb. They saw Jesus. They reported to the apostles, but the apostles didn't believe them. Two of the apostles went to Jesus' tomb. They found it empty. Their report got back to the others, but there's still a hesitation. Mary Magdalene met Jesus, that report goes back to the apostles. But it seems that for the rest of that day, on into the afternoon and through the afternoon, nothing much happens. The apostles seem as though they did nothing more. They just remained passive and uncertain. Now, two of Jesus' followers on the road to Emmaus, they meet up with Jesus. So they go back to the apostles, and by now it appears to be the evening time. They report, and then Jesus, this is purely my imagination, it's almost like Jesus thinking, oh, I've just got to go to these guys and get them to wake up. So Jesus presents himself, and even there he's got to persuade them, because their first reaction is, it's a spirit, it's a ghost. So he says, look, touch me, see my wounds. Give me something to eat. Ghosts don't eat. So finally he gets the message across, except to Thomas, who isn't there. And Thomas said, no, doesn't matter that all you guys say you saw him. I'm not going to believe until I get the evidence. So 8 days later, Thomas gets the evidence as well. So these guys just had to be dragged into belief, even though Jesus had prophesied to them what was going to happen. Now, when we put all of these details together, what we see is that attempts to put forward an alternate idea and deny the resurrection just don't stand up. It has been argued that the women went to the wrong tomb, but it was less than 48 hours since they'd been to the tomb. It was light by the time they got to the tomb. So the idea that they went to the wrong tomb doesn't hold water. And what about the fact that the guards had been there at the tomb? So there would have been some evidence of their presence at the tomb to identify it as well. And then you've got the two apostles who go there to check it out. And you've got Joseph of Arimathea, who surely would have checked it out. And what about the priest? Didn't they ever go to the tomb and check it out? Surely, if there was the wrong tomb, somebody would have discovered the fact along the way. Then we've got the guards who were bribed to say that they were asleep and that the apostles stole the body. Well, for Roman guards to say that they were asleep on duty was a highly risky thing to do. Even up until, I know, at least the 20th century, you could be shot for sleeping on duty. So the guards were putting themselves at a great deal of risk. And what's more, if they had been asleep, they didn't know what happened to the body. And then what about the apostles themselves? An argument is that the apostles somehow got past the guards, opened up the tomb, got the body of Jesus, took it away and hid it somewhere. But there's all sorts of problems. You look at how they conducted themselves that Sunday right through the day. They're not in the frame of mind to be forming a conspiracy. They hadn't grasped really what resurrection was all about. They were passive, they were uncertain, they were unbelieving. They do not appear to have had the courage to try to sneak past Roman guards and get into the tomb and steal the body. And anyway, would they then spend the rest of their lives being persecuted and being martyred, preaching something that they know to be false? When we examine all the facts, the evidence indicates that Jesus did indeed arise from the dead, just as the Bible says. The Bible is true. Jesus Christ is Lord and Saviour. God does exist because the proven Lord and Saviour pointed to that fact. So what should be our response? We need to believe. We need to commit ourselves to Christ through faith, through repentance, through baptism into Christ. We need to walk with Christ and hold to our faith. And if you do want to check further, there are books that go into this in a whole lot more detail to show you that the evidence definitely favours the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let's stand and sing.